One of the really notable things about Marco Rubio's civilizational rhetoric at Munich, and I mean, it was a shocker, that speech, but what was most shocking about it was it's not at all new in terms of the rhetoric from particularly the sort of American and the sort of nationalist European groups. But given you are a specialist in migration, I'm just wondering, what is the function of the fear of migration in the sort of within the bunker at the moment? Is it a case of the elites exploiting popular fear and social prejudice really about migration, or why do you think the anti-immigrant or anti-migration rhetoric perhaps is so strong at the moment within the sort of, I guess, the conservative side of the Atlantic Alliance?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say there are actually so many reasons. So many reasons why. Some are like more moral, ideological, and others are even, one could say, operational. So on the one hand, or where to start? So if we are currently in a moment where everything is tied to defense, or offense, to security, to war, and so on, then finding an enemy in, for example, migrants also means that on the one hand, you are distracting the population from maybe their own hardships because of the economies stagnating or even in recession and so on. That's one could say, classical reason. The other reason could even be to exactly strengthen this meta framework, this idea, even in the population itself. So not only in the group of elites, but the population at large, that there is good and evil, barbarian and civilized, and so on. So, and why would anybody want it? Well, if we want to, if we want to push people into war or hybrid warfare or high intensity, low intensity, it doesn't matter. But if we want to push them in these types of situations and contexts and so on, then we need to influence them and prime them for seeing enemies everywhere and understanding that they are the good people, on the side of goodness and all of that. So this is one reason. Another reason could be even operational, in the sense that they are indeed trying to push out people that could be, from groups that could be resistance, a type of resistance if the situation worsens. And another reason could also be that if people see that their neighbors and so on, just for being migrants, can be taken away or what have you, then they will maybe think twice before they too engage in being a dissenter, any type of resistance for these developments that we are seeing. So there are very different reasons for it. And another one is, of course, that the more difficult it is to migrate to a country and be there, etc., the less rights you will have once you are there, and the more you will accept the most horrendous conditions of work and living. And this is, people can exploit it, like owners of whatever that use these type of workers. And so that's why I would say there are really very different levels of why this migration topic is being so emphasized. Also, another reason is just simply for the sheer reason of this meta framework, that indeed some of these elites really have this as an ideology, that people that are not European or what have you are whatever, but not good.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that was the truly astonishing thing I found about Marco Rubio's speech. But it is quite fascinating because it's something because it's both it's across politics to some degree in Europe, but particularly on the right, I guess. But I come from Australia, and we're a very high migration country, and generally pretty positive. I mean, in recent times there's been outbursts of anti-migration rhetoric, particularly targeting South Asian migrants, but generally we're pretty positive. But I mean, talking about Australia, just one of the things I was keen to ask you about is how different countries within the sort of network of the, I guess, broad Western Alliance have different experiences of the bunker state. And we may come to Australia in a minute, but you've written a little bit about Latin America's experience, and clearly there was a clear case of hostage taking earlier this year in Venezuela, a kidnapping, and Mexico's been subjected to all sorts of pressure and other situations as well. What do you see as the experience of, I guess, the Latin American countries, Central South American, Caribbean countries in the bunker state at the moment?
Yeah, well, I would say that we could even say that this region of the world rather is seen at the moment specifically by the US power elites as a kind of region that will be used, or they want to use it, for their resources, all types of resources, whether these are minerals or oil or their people, or even strategic positioning in the world. Simply that. So, and what like the different countries are trying to do is not every country. I mean, that's the thing. It's a process whereby the US government or even corporations try to influence the processes there, specifically democratic processes, I mean of elections and so on. And thus different countries are more to the right and others more progressive or more left. And those that are more on the progressive side, I would say they still they can't be outright resisting totally. I mean, maybe Cuba is the only example that is really one that is still not captured at all. But maybe Nicaragua. But Venezuela, for example, well, Maduro, the president of Venezuela, was kidnapped. And in the other cases, for example, of Colombia or Mexico, we see that they are trying to, negotiate with the current administration in the US to, not be overrun militarily even, because the US administration is threatening them with invasion or strikes, drone strikes or what have you. So, for example, in the case of Mexico, it's on the one hand a country that has different types of resources like lithium, like oil, but it also has a lot of ports, and they don't want these ports to go to or have any influence from other countries. Also, they don't want any of these countries trade or have diplomatic or any kind of relations with these other countries like Iran, like China and Russia. So in a way, I would say also because of the geographic proximity that unlike other parts of the world, it's much, much more difficult for the countries in the Caribbean and in Latin America to really be able to absolutely say no and resist all of these attacks on, sovereignty and so on. I think they have to do trade-offs whether they like it or not. And the other thing that I also mentioned in one of my texts, I think, is that what you also see in Latin America is that precisely because they are in the geographic proximity of the US, they have not had this experience of being able to build their states up without or with little intrusion in the way they would want to. So it's always a cycle of trying to build something up, and then it's destroyed, and then again, and then. So they are in a much, I would say, more difficult position in that regard, and because they are so strategic for the US, but also because simply history and geography is so simple, but it's true.
And I mean, Australia, like Mark Carney of living in truth at Davos, at least for a few moments, fame, is actually in Australia at the moment, and he's talking about building up cooperation between middle powers, really not in opposition to the United States, but really to primarily to protect multilateral system and to head, to de-risk and things like that. But Australia, it's interesting, a lot of the Australian elites, particularly in the media, and we are dominated by Rupert Murdoch's media companies, thankfully in Australia, are absolutely freaking out at the idea that, maybe Mark Carney will get us into trouble with the US by saying things he shouldn't, sort of thing. So, yeah, Australia's a very extreme case, a long, long way from the United States, but actually critical, I guess, to the sort of Western Pacific American control, of the geopolitics of the world. But what about Europe? Because you've also written, and we've had a few discussions online too about, well, is Europe how independent is Europe really? Does Europe really want to be? And yet, Europe, it strikes me, has got the potential strengths and to pursue a more independent policy, but it doesn't. And you've reflected on this quite a bit. Why is it that Europe constantly makes itself into a vassal of the USA?
Yeah, well, I would say it's not necessarily that it makes itself constantly into a vessel, but rather that it was a slow and long process of vassalization, or however one wants to call it. In the sense, I mean, one can start where, but at least one could say that with NATO after World War II, I mean, I would even say it goes a little bit further, but at least with the creation of NATO and European Union and institutions and kind of these types of organizations, Europe was pulled more and more into the US sphere, and exactly, I mean, not only through NATO and thus military infrastructure, not only through that, but also through soft power, which means through like politicians that have careers in US American think tanks and scholarships and funding and all of these types of things in the US, or at least in transatlantic organizations. So this is another reason. And so there was like this what I call elite capture, but it was a slow process. And specifically, I would even say that in the 1990s, when we had like this was the post-Cold War era, and you could say, or one could have said, oh, well, now the Soviet Union is gone. This is the unipolar moment. We don't need any enemies anymore because of ideology or so. But, well, that wasn't the plan. So, I mean, the plan or the process. Rather, it was a process whereby the US led NATO, US government, and so on, had said, we cannot now let just everybody be, because at the end of the day, all of these countries that, I mean, they say it, even if it sounds really dumb, they say that because some countries are so big and have so many capabilities and resources and so on, they will eventually not let themselves exploit themselves by the US or US elite. So, and Europe, in this sense, could have been could have had the idea, and it did have the idea to cooperate with Russia, for example, or in general with Eastern Europe, and even in the 2000s, then with China and so on. So what the US then saw this danger, this process, and said we need to stop it. I mean, I don't know how consciously, but in their speeches and conferences in the 1990s of NATO reports and so on, that's basically what they say, that they cannot let Europe or European countries cooperate with Russia, because this would take away, this would make Europe and Eastern Europe or Russia have or become another pole, one could say, another a more important role in the world order, so to speak. And they cannot let this happen, because in their minds, no country, no region in the world can have can become a peer competitor and so on. So they needed to capture the EU or the European countries, their leaders or their elites and so on, even more. And they did this by, for one, expanding NATO, for also by doing more NATO type of interventions. What else? Then in the 2000s, after the financial crisis, I would say that there was also another moment where there were, for example, more technocratic leaders, technocratic in the sense that they all had worked in areas or spheres that are not political, or not classical political, but rather finance and investment and so on. And I mean, nowadays, I think even the percentage is much higher of these type of politicians with these types of trajectories. And so all of these different processes then ultimately led to European political leaders being much more tied to the US. I mean, even one could say that the destruction of Nord Stream, I don't remember when it was, but some years ago, even could have been like a warning, like you need to do what we say. So there are different types of processes, material, even military, political, those that are based on soft power and so on, that had led to this gradual capture, because it's not like it was always that way, or that all these European leaders since time being were vassals of the US.
Yeah. Well,
So
I mean, I can remember some who weren't.
Yeah. So there were
Yeah.
different groups and processes, but they have been, and I think today or in this year more than before, they have been filtered out. Some are even disinterest, basically. And what we now have are those that come, for example, from these banking, finance, investment trajectories, but that also or come from more NATO security backgrounds. And apart from this, the US again now has, or the US elites have now changed the script from from being more about human rights or rules-based order and such things, and now more about force, and apparently even now more about really saying, okay, this is about US interests. And the leaders of Europe, they just say yes, and right. And even at when was at the Munich Security Conference, I mean, I watched so many panels, and it was basically, I mean, yes, they talked about autonomy or independence, but it was never, rather about autonomy than independence. It was always with a focus on strength, on defense, on war capabilities, and always within the framework of NATO, not in any other way. So, and even saying stuff like, basically, I mean, I think they used other words, but basically saying, oh, this threat of Trump about Greenland. Well, we are thankful that he did this because he woke us up to spend more for the military, basically. So that's what they said. And so it has been a slow process, but I would say right now we are in a acceleration, basically. And even where, I mean, even though they try to be, or they I am more open about actions they will take and about the, let's say, ideology they are using and so on. They still have some language that tries to obscure this. For example, now in the case of this Iran situation, talking about defense, being defensive, when clearly not.